about this topic. My name is Adora Spitak, and I really enjoy learning about history, and history is one of my favorite topics, and I've done a lot of research on this topic as well as others, but more specifically because it's a right to learn presentation, that means we're going to be using writing and discussion to learn about it, then I feel a little bit qualified to talk about it because I published my first book, Flying Fingers, when I was 7, and more recently I published a second book called Dancing Fingers with my older sister Agana. So I really love the idea of using writing to learn about other things, especially history, being another one of my favorite topics. So I want to start with what child labor is exactly. So have you ever told your parents, oh, you shouldn't be making me clean this house, it's child labor, or going to school, I feel like a child labor? Have any of you ever said something like that? You can raise your hand if you have. I know I have, maybe once or twice. I see some raised hands. Yeah, we've sometimes used that comment, oh, I feel like a child laborer, whenever our parents make us do too much work, or we just really don't feel like going to school. But child labor, according to the dictionary, is the full-time employment of children, especially of those who are legally too young to work. So the difference between what we do and what a genuine child laborer does is quite a lot. One of them is the full-time employment. I'm guessing that most of you are probably not spending all of your time having to clean the house, not being able to go to school, and being restricted from seeking further opportunities. So child labor definitely is a topic that's a little bit confusing to some people, because child labor, just looking at the title, you might think, oh, well, it's any kids who are doing work. But it's basically full-time, and oftentimes it can take away opportunities from kids. So what do you think of when you hear child labor? What are some of your thoughts or some of the things you already know?
Kids who work.
Kids who work, okay, what else?
Possibly child abuse.
Okay, maybe abusive.
Athletes, guys, what do you think about that? Maybe working in a way you don't want to.
Okay, work in a way you don't want to. Now think about what are some countries that you think it might be taking place, or what do you know about what sort of jobs that children often have to do? What do you know about that?
Possibly China.
Okay. So yeah, we can put down China might be a place where some child labor is taking place. Where else?
Brazil.
Brazil. What else?
Libya.
Libya, very interesting one. And anywhere else?
Africa.
Okay, so Africa, the continent, as opposed to a country. Great. So, what is something that you notice about these areas? What is something that they have in common?
They don't have rights.
They don't have rights, or they don't have very strong laws maybe against child labor. So a lot of times, and a lot of these are also developing countries. So they haven't, they haven't reached the economic level of countries like, say, the United States or Germany, where there isn't so much child labor going on right now. But if you look back in the past and you see where child labor happened, then it was very widespread. You'd find child labor in Victorian England. You would find child labor in the early 1900s here in the United States, in New York, in New Jersey, pretty much anywhere there were factories or farms where kids could do work, there could be child labor. So now most countries like the United States and England have developed or become developed countries, have passed laws and passed restrictions, and so today the new countries that are home to lots of child labor tend to be developing countries. So we're going to be learning more about that in a few minutes. But child labor can mean lost childhoods, opportunities, and sometimes even lives, because the work that children are sometimes forced to do can put them in very hazardous conditions. But I want to ask you, why do you think child labor matters? Why do we need to learn about it?
So we can learn more about the cultures of other.
Learning more about the cultures of other countries.
Okay, so learning more about culture and international education. What else?
How many rights we might have.
Okay, rights. Anything else?
Anybody? Why should we bother to learn about those? Someone can find out. He's not the only one in the room.
Okay, so I want you to think about, so someone did say rights, and I think that's a really important point that we should look at is what rights do we have, and what are rights given to children in other countries, and what are some rights that should be universal? So what are rights that everyone should have? And, oh, I see some more raised hands.
Julia. How does that fit into the right, our right to be free, whether it does or not? Anybody else? Martha. Getting a good education, how important that is.
Yes, education. Sorry, I'm writing off to the side a little here. But another thing, another reason to keep yourself educated about child labor is because when you know about the problem, when you know about the history, and when you know about the present of child labor, then you can be committed to doing something about it. It's really hard to go in and solve problems if you don't know what the problem is or where the problem is. But when we learn about child labor, then we can learn things which will help us know more about how to combat it. So, for instance, organizations that would fight child labor, what are the roots of child labor, and what do we know about countries where child labor is common. And so when you learn more about an issue, you come up with ways to solve it or to fight the problem. So you can't simply say child labor is bad without learning about what child labor is. You want to figure out, well, how can I solve the problem instead of just saying, okay, it's a bad thing or it happens a lot. By learning about it, then we can find ways to help solve the problem. So let's start with history. Have you ever heard the saying that we can learn from the past or we can learn from history? Yeah, it's very common. A lot of people say we can learn from our mistakes, we can learn from the past. So child labor in the past, as I mentioned, actually took place in the countries that we now think of as developed. So places like England, child labor in Victorian England was very common. What are some jobs that children might perform in Victorian England? Does anyone know?
Working in factories.
Great. What else?
Farming.
Farming. What else?
Delivering newspapers.
Newspapers, yeah, probably. And anything else? Okay, well, you guys named quite a lot of the jobs. There's one more, but children really did a variety of jobs. If there was a job that an adult did, then there was often a job that a child did. And there were some jobs that children did that were even, that people thought that children were better at even. So at the beginning of Queen Victoria's reign, around the early 1800s, then poor children as young as 5 might work for a living. And children did various kinds of jobs, and many of these jobs were unpleasant and dangerous because children were small; they could fit in the small spaces. So a lot of work that they did might be in coal mines. So some children worked in coal mines, pushing trucks of coal to the surface. So take a look at this picture, and so that's a cart of coal that's just been mined, and so coal would be used to fuel people's homes and cooking, and it was used for a whole lot of things. And children would be pushing it up and pulling it up like that through a very dark, very narrow passageway. And they probably didn't have much light. So it's very dusty, it's probably very smelly, you don't have very much air, it's dark, and you're in a tiny little enclosed space pulling up this very heavy cart. So that was that job. Not very pleasant. Now there's still coal mining going on today, but luckily it generally does not involve the use of children like that. But what do you think is one reason that they might have used kids for that job?
Their size.
I'm sorry?
Their size?
Their size, yes, probably. If you look at the tunnel, it's just about the right size. What else?
The young work harder.
Yeah, the younger they were, maybe the harder that they could work without complaining about it.
Yeah, exactly. It was very. If you were a child, you would have been taught don't complain, be very respectful of adults. You know, as a lot of kids are taught today. But in the case of child laborers, it really wasn't because they couldn't complain, because they couldn't talk back. Then they weren't. Then they had to work really hard. They had to work all these hours without being able to really say, "I'm hungry. I'm really tired. My back is breaking." All of that. So working in coal mines, their size was ideal for the job, and then also they could work really hard and not complain. Others would open and shut doors to allow air to circulate through the tunnels. So these coal mines were very basic. In order to have air from the top come into the coal mines, which would go very deep, then you had all these series of doors which would have to be opened and closed in order to get air to go past. And they also would work in the dark, sometimes only with the light of a candle. So again, this very dusty, very small, very dry place with being very dark as well with just the light of a candle. Others would work in factories, and they might have jobs that required some very fine work with their hands and machinery. Those would be jobs like repairing broken threads in cotton mills. So what do you think would be some of the dangers? How would you become injured or somehow get an injury while being on the job?
Poked with a needle?
That would be one thing. What else? When you're handling heavy machinery or when you have big pieces of equipment, what could happen?
Getting hurt by that machine?
Yes. So if you're using your hands and you're going in and out of a machine or you're repairing threads and there's a machine involved, there's always a heavy possibility as well of possibly getting your hands injured, especially with a lot of these machines not having some of the safety precautions that they might have today. So these children might get injured very easily, but the unfortunate thing was because they were so poor and because some of them might have been homeless or because some of them might not have had parents there all the time to take care of them, a lot of them, if you got injured, you might just lose your job and become even poorer. So the laws back then, and that might happen even to adults who got injured, there weren't really very good labor laws at the time. So looking at these jobs, what do you think about the jobs? Why do you think that people would just let this happen?
Why would people just let this happen? They needed the money.
They needed the money. That could be one thing. Definitely, people looked at child labor as a cheap source of labor, and they saw children and they thought, okay, I can use them to work in my factory and I'll make more money. But what else might have been a reason? Let's say maybe you have a good heart. You don't really care about money, but you still use child labor. Why would you use child labor?
Because the person might not want to do the work him or herself.
That's a possibility. If you're looking for labor, and you might use children because they were readily available, but there were also adults who were willing to work as well. So what else do you think as far as society? Like, why did so many people, even those who weren't running factories, might hire children to clean their chimneys or would buy products from factories that used children? Why do you think so many people just thought it was okay?
They didn't care if they got hurt.
Maybe they weren't necessarily looking out for the safety of the child or the adult.
Yeah, they might have not really been looking at that. They might have not thought that the children could really get hurt. But another thing you have to look at is also, as far as history, before Victorian England, there were children working in many different circumstances. Child labor, we really formalized child labor as in this is what child labor is around the time we started noticing it. And when people started taking a look at, oh, these are dangerous conditions, children shouldn't be doing this work. So from very early periods, children could be treated like young adults. In the Middle Ages, when when the peasants were on the farms, then a lot of peasant children would be doing work on the farms along with their parents. So with this long history of children doing work, it might have been considered pretty normal or pretty acceptable for children to be doing work up until this time period when people started noticing, taking pictures, writing, interviewing these kids, and really taking issue with the idea that kids would be doing kind of dangerous work. So you have to look at the idea that first it was very easy to use children to make money, but then second that many people might have also considered it pretty acceptable. Now this is a picture of someone with this long row of machinery here doing a job at a factory, probably like repairing threads or working with cotton. And they were made to work very long hours with very little pay because there were just no laws to protect them. So today, the reason that you won't walk into a factory and find hundreds of children working at the machines is because we have laws, and lots of laws on the books that say children can't work this many hours, children under this age can only work this many hours, it can only be this type of work. So there's lots of laws to protect kids. Now, why do you think we have all these laws? Why didn't people just say, oh, I'm sure that the factory owners will just stop using child labor? Why do you think we've made all these laws as opposed to just saying child labor is wrong?
So kids aren't getting hurt as often as they were.
So kids weren't getting hurt as often as they were. Yeah, because you can, because a lot of people were campaigning. They would tell the people who are running the factories, you shouldn't use child labor. It's very bad for the kids. But sometimes those people would keep on using child labor because it was just such an easy money-making thing to do. So by making laws, and they ensured that across the books it was illegal, you really couldn't do it unless you wanted to get fined or thrown in jail. And so that was a pretty strong incentive for people to stop using child labor. But even with the laws, sometimes they weren't enforced very well. It was definitely a little bit of a time period before the laws became very normal and very enforced. So that's a look at work generally in the city would be coal mining or factory work. Let's take a look at work in the countryside. So do you think work in the countryside would be harder, easier, about the same? What's your opinion?
It would be harder because they had to farm lots of crops.
It might be harder because they had a big area of crops to farm. Yeah, so that's very possible. And it would be hard, probably if you asked child labor in the city, do you think your work that you're doing is harder than farming? They might say, oh, it's definitely harder. But if you ask the farming child, they might say, my work is harder. So it really depends on the side of the hill, I guess. So children in the country also worked. They would pick up stones before the crops were sown to scare away birds. So that might be a job, but they would also do many of the jobs that adults did. They might help harvesting or planting. And the hours were long and often the weather was cold. So how many of you have a garden at home? Raise your hand if you have a garden at home. Okay, I'm seeing some raised hands. Now, do you consider what you do in your garden, whether it's maybe planting or watering the plants, would you consider that child labor?
No.
No, probably not. So why do you think your work isn't child labor and the children on the farms is?
Because you would choose to be doing it kind of as a hobby.
Okay, what else?
Because we weren't working heavy machinery that kids were working with back then.
Okay, so maybe you're not working with dangerous machinery. What else? What else? Even if your parents, let's say your parents have to tell you to water the plants every day, they're sort of dragging your feet to water the plants. What else do you think makes, even though you're sort of ordered to do it by your parents, what do you think makes it not child labor when this is?
You're not doing it every single day. You're not doing it like full-time job.
Exactly. Yeah, you get to go to school, you probably go to friends' houses sometimes. You do other things besides watering the plants or taking care of the garden. Additionally, if you don't take care of the garden, if you suddenly decide, no, I don't want to water the plants today, I'm tired of this, your parents might ground you, but they probably aren't going to beat you up or otherwise abuse you as a result. They might just be a little annoyed that you're not taking care of the garden. But these kids definitely had it a lot harder than you do, because many of them, they weren't able to go to school. They had to work very long hours out in the cold, and it was very backbreaking work because you're always bending over often to take care of the crops. So according to Corbis, the image site where I got the next image from, and teams of children could be hired out to farmers. So these children, often poor, they would be gathered up, and then they would be made to work for 8 or 9 hours a day, and often had to work 3 or 4 miles to and from work. So there would be these teams of children, kind of like contractors. They would be hired out to farmers who would hire them to do some work around the farm, and so they would do a lot of work planting seeds or preparing the ground. So if you were part of a team of children like this, you would have to walk really far to get to your workplace. You might have to walk to several miles every day to different farms in the cold doing all this backbreaking work. Now, I kind of asked why employers might want to use children versus adults, because it was cheaper to hire children. Children could be cheated out of their wages sometimes. They couldn't speak up very easily. And additionally, then their small bodies and light fingers made them better for certain jobs like working with thread or sweeping chimneys. And that's actually one that we haven't talked about too much, is sweeping chimneys. Now, when you think of chimney sweeps, you might think of adults, because in the movies, if you saw Mary Poppins, chimney sweep, always an adult, but there were many children who would be doing the chimney sweep job. So, have you ever, raise your hand if your house has a chimney? Okay, I'm seeing a couple raised hands, not too many. A few. So my house has a chimney, but it's not actually functional. But now this chimney sweeping job was kind of essential because the chimneys would get really dirty, very black and sooty because of all the dust that would gather on the side, and then this would make it might affect the rest of the house, make it smell bad, and you wouldn't really want to be in that area near the fireplace. So people would hire these chimney sweeps to go up into the chimney with a big mop or a big broom to get all the dust down. But what would happen with these chimney sweeps would be covered in dust, they'd be covered in soot, and it really was not good for them to breathe at all. And if you think about the people working in the coal mines, it's the same thing, breathing in all that poisonous dust. So now that we've talked about child labor in Victorian England, I wanted to ask you, why do you think when you go to England now, you're not going to see much child labor? Why, aside from the laws, what do you think was the attitude, how did attitudes change, and why did attitudes change about child labor?
Because the children started to speak up.
Children started to speak up? That's possible. There were some children who might complain to newspapers or complain to reporters, but there weren't actually that many cases. There were definitely more than before, but that was a small part of a big picture. What are some other parts that might have led to this change?
More adults thought that children were getting hurt.
More adults saw that children were getting hurt. There was definitely more concern because it seemed like children were doing some very dangerous work, working with machines. And another thing was that people saw that children were often getting exploited. They were being taken advantage of because they could be used for cheap labor. So when people saw that, then they started writing editorials. They started pushing for laws to be made, writing to the factory owners, talking to the factory owners, trying to get children to be able to go to school. So there was this steady campaign against child labor going on in places like Victorian England. Now let's talk about child labor in the U.S. So how do you think child labor in the U.S. might be different? And this is also 1908 to 1912, so a little later, but how do you think it might be different? I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
No, hold on, we're just trying to get clarity on the answer. About okay, perhaps the weather in the U.S. was different. making it easier, harder, a variable?
Well, there's also a thing with they did some different jobs, some of the same jobs, but some different jobs. What are some jobs that you think the children in the U.S. might have done?
Farming.
Farming,
Farming, probably so. What else?
also working in factories,
Working in factories, probably so. Yes. Anything else?
Working at a shop.
shops or store kind of work.
Possibly. So in the U.S., then child labor was a little bit different from in Victorian England because this was a slightly different. This is a little later. Victorian England was in the late 1800s. This is in the early 1900s. So the work that children did was sometimes similar. A lot of children did work in factories because the country was definitely growing a lot, and there were all these people who needed new shirts, who needed new pants, and so children would often do this work in factories, or sometimes immigrant children. So there were lots of immigrants, especially on cities on the East Coast, like New York City, for instance, had many immigrants. And I actually went to New York City and got to visit a tenement, which is basically an apartment and often, sometimes there would be specific areas where an immigrant family might live, like if you were from Italy, then you would go to the Italian section, or from Ireland, you would go to the Irish area. So people often would stay with people they knew. But sometimes these immigrants coming in would be very poor, and they would have to take in work. And what would often happen would be the children would be at home, and they would help sew together pieces of fabric to make shirts, and that would be, then they would get money for that to support their family. So a lot of stuff in the garment area, as well as in newspaper selling. So we're going to take a look at some pictures and the people behind them. So this is Furman Owens. He's 12 years old. He was 12 years old. He couldn't read and did not know his ABCs. He said that he wanted to learn, but he couldn't when he worked all the time. So these are pictures that were taken by Louis Hine, a very famous photographer who took lots of pictures of child laborers like Furman. Now these are some children, and this is the kind of dangerous machinery I was talking about. So you can see they're standing up on it, and they have these rolls of thread that they are working with over there. And so some boys and girls were so small they had to climb up onto the spinning frame to mend broken threads and to put back empty bobbins or cylinders wound with thread or wire. So again, this is one of those jobs that children's small fingers might make it easier to do, but sometimes they were so tiny, and the machinery is obviously really big and not designed for children. So this is another girl at a factory, a spinner in Whitnall Cotton Mill. Sometimes works at night, earns 48 cents a day. When asked how old she was, she hesitated, then said, "I don't remember," then added confidently, "I'm not old enough to work, but do just the same." So during this time, there were some things that said, as she said, "I'm not old enough to work, but do just the same." There were some things that children, should go to school, and children probably should be laboring inside factories, but a lot of children did anyway. It was a lot of people looked the other way while factories hired children, despite there sometimes being rules against it. Now, newspaper selling was also a big source of child labor. A lot of people would go out and sell newspapers, but this is a little bit different from going on a neighborhood delivery route early in the morning before you go to school. This would be, again, full-time work. So why do you think selling a newspaper might be considered child labor? What's so hard about selling a newspaper?
Have to walk really far.
You'd probably have to walk a far distance, you'd be standing all day. What else?
Have to get up really early in the morning.
Get up really early in the morning. What else?
The weather could be really hot.
The weather could be terrible. It could be raining and freezing, or it could be so warm you'd be sweating all day. What else?
Yeah, constantly on your feet, nowhere to sit.
Constantly on your feet, nowhere to sit. Very good. And is there one more?
All the newspapers.
Carrying the heavy bag of the newspapers.
Yeah, carrying the heavy bag of the newspapers. So another thing to consider would be that they might not have had the opportunity to go to school because they would be working this full-time employment. So this is Tony Cassell, age 11, and he had been selling newspapers. Sometimes sells until 10 p.m., the description said. His paper So when they say his paper, that means the newspaper that he sells, the organization. Told me the boy had shown him the marks on his arm where his father had bitten him for not selling more papers. So this boy was getting abused by his father, getting bitten on the arm for not selling more papers. So there was this huge pressure because of the money that they brought in to sell more papers, keep on selling, try to sell more. Why can't you sell more? Because often families might depend on a child and child labor to provide money to buy food and other necessities. So there was also abuse in it as well. So this is a very little boy selling papers over here, age 8, a newsboy, and the boy just recovered from his second attack of pneumonia. Does anyone know what pneumonia is?
It's like a deadly disease.
Well, say it again? Yeah, what does it affect?
Oh,
Yeah, what part of your body? Your lungs.
Your
Lung
lungs.
disease.
It's a very hard disease to have because, or a sickness to get because you're coughing all the time. It can be difficult to breathe. It affects your lungs, and so this is not a good sickness for a little child of 8 to get. It's not. I mean, obviously, it's not good for anyone to get, but it's especially a lot of these sicknesses. A lot of sicknesses are especially dangerous to elderly people and to young children, and so he's an example of a young child. And he just recovered from his second attack of pneumonia and was found selling papers during a big rainstorm. So the conditions that these children worked in the cold, in the rain, sometimes they might not have enough money to buy themselves a proper coat, and working long hours would contribute to them getting sicknesses. Especially when you think about the kids working in the coal mines, working as chimney sweeps, they would have a higher chance of getting possibly cancers because of the dangerous toxic elements they were exposed to. I'm sorry, there's like a screeching noise right by the, oh, it's sort of stopped now. There was a noise over before. So this is another picture of one of those newsboys, and he looks kind of happy in this picture. He's smiling. It's a very cute picture. He's 5 years old, 41 inches high, and he jumps on and off moving train cars at the risk of his life, according to the caption. So basically what would happen is a train starts moving, he jumps on, I'm assuming so that he doesn't have to pay money, and he goes around selling newspapers so to the people on the train. Now you might think, okay, that's not so bad of a job, but obviously jumping on and moving train cars every day, there's a high possibility one time you might fall off, you might not catch it, you could get run over. So a very dangerous job, not to mention there's that added element of being out in the weather, working long hours at 5 years old. Then these are kids working in a coal mine, and according to the caption, the dust was so dense at times as to obscure the view. The dust penetrated the utmost recesses of the boys' lungs. A kind of slave driver sometimes stands over the boys, prodding or kicking them into obedience. So why do you think, what are some results of all this dust that might be around them?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
Sure. What are some of the results of all the dust? Do you think that they might get certain diseases, or how would it affect them?
Can you be more specific? I'm sorry. Yeah, hard time breathing.
Hard time breathing would probably get in your nose, get in your throat and lungs. What else?
Perhaps asthma.
Asthma, yeah, definitely a high chance. What else?
You like talking not as good hygiene?
Perhaps not such great hygiene.
Not great hygiene, yeah, definitely. And a lot of these kids, they would emerge from the coal mine or emerge from the chimney or whatever they were doing, and they would just be covered from head to toe in soot. There would be this black powder all over. And because showers and baths might not have been so readily available to children, especially children who are very poor, then they might just have to brush themselves off or pour a little water over themselves as best as they could. They might not have that many extra changes of clothes or anything. So definitely the hygiene would be affected. They would find it hard to breathe. They might develop diseases later on. And have you ever walked into a kind of dusty room or picked up something really dusty and then sneezed? Probably all had that experience at some point. being in some really dusty place and sneezing a lot. And so if you imagine being surrounded by dust at all hours or at many hours, then of course it would be a really bad environment to be sneezing. You have a hard time breathing, all that. So, what are some similarities you notice between labor in the U.S., child labor in the U.S., and child labor in Victorian England? What are some of the similarities?
Like maybe
Similar type job.
Okay, similar types of jobs. What else?
No freedom.
No freedom. Yeah, definitely the children in these pictures, even though they might be out selling newspapers, which seems like, oh, you could always run away, but there might have not been a whole lot to run away to. At the time, there still wasn't a very comprehensive system for, if you were an abused child, there weren't a whole lot of people to turn to. Today, we have so many different organizations that work to protect children or that children can turn to for help, but back then, again, it was considered a little more acceptable for children to be out selling newspapers, working, even at really nasty hours. So that would be another similarity, was that society often, that many people might have had that perception. What else?
Aaron.
they all have bad working conditions.
Bad working conditions, yes. Anything else?
Made very little money.
Made very little money, yes, definitely. So again, if you think about the reasons that people use children, small bodies and easy to cheat out of their wages. They didn't have to pay that much because, for whatever reason, because they were children, they didn't receive as much. And this has been seen a lot of times. These same places might also hire women instead of men because it was thought you could give women less money. Because you would think, oh, well, men are supposed to be the breadwinners, so we don't have to pay women as much. So they're probably married, or if they're not married, they're living with their families, so we don't have to pay them. And with children, it was even more of that, because children had, it was thought, would have both of their parents to support them, so why do we need to pay them so much? But the reality was that a lot of times these children might not have had parents who were bringing them money, or might not have been very much money. So child laborers didn't have the time to study very often. Working full time, you didn't really have time to go to school. What do you think would be some of the